Hey friends, Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast. I'm him. Got a great show for you today because we have two awesome, very smart ladies joining me. I'm going to talk poverty with Talk Poverty's Rebecca Vallas. Trump administration announced that they're going to be cutting food stamps for very needy people right before Christmas because they're cruel. That's why. Then I'm going to talk to the gate. The gate? I'm going to talk to the gate. I'm not editing this. I'm not going back. I'm not talking to any gates. The gate is closed. Lock the gate. Keep it locked so the dog doesn't get out. I'm going to be speaking with the great Emily Atkin. She's quickly become one of my favorite journalists. She is the purveyor of the Heated newsletter, which comes out Monday through Thursday. If you haven't signed up for it yet, you should. It's where I get my news from reading. I read newsletters. I read newspapers. I read columnists and blogs. I don't watch TV much. And I don't listen to the radio much. I listen to some podcasts like you. Thanks for listening to this one. Thanks for paying for it, too. Oh, my goodness. All of you who have paid subscriptions on patreon.com/Pete Dominic. I cannot thank you enough. Not going to lie to you. Losing my gig at SiriusXM created a mountain of adversity for my family. But I love working on this podcast. It's helped soften the blow a little, especially thanks to almost 200 people who signed up for a paid subscription. Love this song. I'm going to play it again. I love this intro song. Yeah, like almost 200 people have paid for Patreon now. Susie and her husband Scott signed up, and they messaged me on Patreon saying, "May I suggest, Pete, that you explain more slowly and clearly how you and your listeners can pay to support your podcast? Consider saying Patreon more slowly and spell it out, Patreon. If you're going to make the ask, then make the call to action easy. Winky face," she wrote. I thought it was Patreon, P-A-Y. But no matches on the Google machine. Granted, not that hard to figure it out, but that was 30 seconds I've lost forever. So for some who are hesitant already, not getting the link quickly and easily, it could be an easy out. Susie and Scott, thank you. Big shout out to you. Big shout out to everybody on Patreon. I think I have to give more specific shout outs and rewards and acknowledgments. That's what they say. Keep it going. Okay. Well, let's get to my first guest. Just a brief conversation with Rebecca Vallas about the big news that the Trump administration is cutting SNAP, which stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It used to be food stamps. This is a pretty horrific situation for a lot of people who rely on it, and some are calling it Dickensian in its nature because they're cutting it right before Christmas. Over at the New York Magazine, Sarah Jones headline, "Work or Starve, Trump administration tells poor people," and talks a lot about the restrictions on food stamps. The Urban Institute has estimated that the administration's 3 rule changes, if finalized, will deprive around 3.7 million people total of food aid, which is why that music must have halted so dramatically, because it knew I was about to read that horrible stat. Hunger is a national problem. I've worked on this issue. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand this issue, trying to debunk the myths about poor people and working people, but I'm not sure that we're winning that argument. A lot of people just think you're poor because you're not working hard enough, because, I got out of a hole, so you can too. Well, that's not the case. So let's get to it with our first expert, Rebecca Vallas, and then we'll talk to Emily Atkin, who just got done talking to former Secretary of State John Kerry. Lots coming up. Here is my conversation with Rebecca Vallas. All right, let's talk about this with an expert. That's what we like to do here on the podcast. My guest is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she has done amazing work. She is what I refer to as an anti-poverty hero. She's also the host of an awesome podcast, which is about poverty and inequality and everything they intersect with. Rebecca Vallas, my friend, I called her because I can, because she's the best person to talk to about this really horrible idea. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Pete. Thanks so much for having me on the pod.
All right, so there's a lot to discuss here, and there's never enough time to discuss such a big deal. But help us understand this news that the Trump administration is now going to be cutting SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, even further than they already did. But, it's just for able-bodied people. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah, so the latest out of the Trump administration, and it's, just in time for Christmas, so it's like straight out of the pages of Dickens, can't make this stuff up. They have decided to take food stamps away from about 700,000 people. These are people who are struggling to find work, or maybe they can't get enough hours at their job. Those are the people that the Trump administration has decided to take basic, meager food assistance away just in time for Christmas. And they're doing this, of course, on the heels of having given $2 trillion in tax cuts to the wealthiest frickin' people in this country. And the reason that I bring up that second part, even though people might be listening and going, yeah, but what do food stamps have to do with tax cuts?
Right.
It's because the Trump administration tries to make it sound like they're cutting SNAP to save money. But the tax cuts that they just gave to just the top 1%, the richest 1% in the country, actually cost more than the entire SNAP program. So it doesn't exactly pan out, and I feel like that's why I have to bring that up. But that is what they are doing. And make no mistake, just like you said it, they wrap all of this up in this language about able-bodied adults without dependents. They say it's all about work. It has nothing to do with helping anybody work, because taking food away from people who are looking for work is only going to make it harder for folks who are struggling to find jobs. So this is, really just another instance of the cruelty is the point.
Right. The cruelty is the point. I saw you making that point on Twitter, and just going back to the tax cuts. The tax cuts for the wealthiest individuals and corporations, what they do is they created more deficits. Like that's spending. People see the tax cuts as cuts, but they're not. That's if you cut taxes but you don't cut spending, that creates deficits. So the point you're making, just to reiterate, is that is spending, and this is not saving any money, especially because these people need the food to get the job.
Yeah, and for anyone who's not familiar with food stamps, which we now call the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, we're talking about a program that provides about $1.40 per person per meal. That is what Trump is so hell-bent on taking away from hungry people just in time for the holidays. And I should also note, this is something that not just Democrats oppose, but that voters of both parties don't want to see happen. CAP actually just did some polling that just came out this week, finding that 62% of Americans across party lines oppose cutting SNAP. And actually, they want to see the program expanded, because folks understand that the SNAP program is so meager, it's not enough as it is. So here's Trump doing the exact opposite, yet again, of what the American people want. And he's doing it in this kind of backdoor way that's an end run around Congress. Last year, Congress took up a whole bipartisan conversation around reauthorizing the SNAP program, and they, on a bipartisan basis, rejected this exact policy that Trump then decided, because he wasn't happy with Congress not taking food away from a whole bunch of really hungry people. He decided, just like with healthcare, when he was like, "Oh shit, we didn't get the Affordable Care Act repealed, we didn't get Medicaid," he turned around and did a whole bunch of healthcare sabotage. This is exactly the same thing. He didn't get his way legislatively, and so now he's sidestepping Congress to dismantle the food stamp program. And again, he's doing it right in time for the holidays.
Food stamp SNAP comes under the budget and is controlled by the USDA. The USDA's own data shows that over 14 million Americans suffered food insecurity in 2018. Rebecca, you've been working on these issues for a long time. How do you make the point? How do you prove to people that in America there are a lot of hungry individuals and families suffering with what we call in the public policy world with food insecurity?
Yeah, I mean, and the problem is even bigger than that, right? Like people, when you think about poverty, folks often think about like the number of people who are officially poor by government statistics who live below that official poverty measure that we know is does kind of a garbage job of measuring who's actually struggling to make ends meet in this country.
Right.
Surveys tell us that about half of American households, half, are currently struggling to afford basic stuff like food and healthcare and housing. That is the report card for Trump's economy, right? You look at things like the unemployment rate or the jobs numbers, and everyone's like, wow, what a booming economy. Well, yeah, when you only look at certain statistics, but when about half of the country is having a hard time putting food on the table, that tells you everything you need to know about how important our largest food assistance program is. And that's why we see such overwhelming bipartisan support for expanding it so that it no longer is just providing peanuts so that people can, get some cans of beans and tuna and try to make it through the month. Trump doesn't care about the forgotten man and forgotten woman that he pledged to fight for when he was campaigning. He never did. He certainly doesn't now.
Never, yeah.
And this effort to take food away from 700 some thousand people is just Exhibit A.
Congressman Kevin Hern from Oklahoma, he's a Republican, tweeted, "There's nothing quite as empowering as a job. No federal program has the power to pull a person out of poverty. No government handout can help a person find independence and success. Only through gainful employment can a person find true stability." Of course, he is employed by the government. What do you make of that kind of diatribe? You've been hearing that your entire career. It must be tiresome, but that government programs can't pull people out of poverty. Government handouts, as they call them, can't help a person find independence and success.
Yeah, the Trump administration and a lot of Republicans have gotten really good at messaging on policies that are just incredibly cruel and are really just about taking basic help away from people who are struggling. And this is just another example of kind of puppies and rainbows language that makes it sound like they're trying to help people when what they're doing is taking food out of the mouths of people who are struggling to afford basic nutrition. The research is really clear on this. I don't want to get too wonky for your listeners, but like in a nutshell, taking food away from unemployed workers doesn't just not help them magically find work, it's actually counterproductive to the goals of work because having enough nutrition, having adequate nutrition helps people be healthy. It helps them have the energy they need, the mental clarity they need to not just find a job, but to be able to actually keep it once they're in it. And so if we were serious, if policymakers like the Trump administration officials working on nutrition were serious about actually helping people have what they need to be able to find jobs and then thrive in them, the thing they would be doing, top of their list, would be making sure that food is a right in this country, that everybody has access to basic nutrition. And I would add to that list that everyone has a roof over their head and healthcare and everything else that we know the Trump administration is also trying to take away from people who are struggling to make ends meet. And so, like, just anyone who hears those kinds of messages should not just raise an eyebrow, but throw them in the trash because they're garbage distractions from what this is really about. This is about taking food out of the mouths of unemployed and underemployed workers and kicking them while they're down, while tax cuts continue to get lavished on the wealthiest people in this country. That is what is really going on.
And what about this is easier for a lot of people to swallow because they talk about able-bodied adults. There are obviously a lot of children that are going to be affected here as well, but nobody seems to be talking about them. Am I right?
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, we would be remiss if we didn't mention, Pete, that this is just one of three attacks that the Trump administration has waged on SNAP just this year.
Yes,
So
good point.
after Congress, on a bipartisan basis, said, you know what? Let's not cut this really important program. Let's reauthorize it and move on. That was on a bipartisan basis last year. Trump, this was the first rule that he moved forward through a regulatory process, the one that that's being finalized now, this one about taking food away from jobless workers. But there are two other attacks that are currently pending and that he's moving forward through the regulatory machinery of the federal government as we speak. And combined, the three policies would take food away from almost 4 million people, including taking free school lunch away from about 1 million kids.
Unbelievable.
So this is just one part of an incredibly cruel and draconian agenda on the part of this administration to massively increase hunger and hardship in this country.
What do we do?
Well, I think what we're going to see next is probably some pretty serious litigation, similar to what we've seen in the healthcare context, because there are a lot of public interest lawyers and others out there who don't want to see this rule actually take effect. It's scheduled to go into effect early next year, but there's a little bit of time for it to potentially get challenged in the courts. There have been multiple moments where we've seen hundreds of thousands of people raise their voices and issue public comments telling Trump, please don't do this. But, unfortunately, in this moment, none of those comment periods are open. And so what we need to continue to do is to hold this administration accountable and continue to raise our voices, whether that's on Twitter, whether that's calling your member of Congress and saying, this is not what I want my policymakers, my leaders in this country to be doing. And the other thing I think people can pay a little bit of attention to right now is an effort that we are watching move forward in the House of Representatives, which of course is controlled by the Democrats, to expand the food stamp program. And that effort is right now being led by Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Congresswoman Alma Adams from California and North Carolina, respectively. They've got more than 100 co-sponsors on a couple of pieces of legislation to expand the food stamp program so that benefits don't run out for after 2 to 3 weeks of the month, because the benefits are so meager. And that's what happens for most families. So those are a couple of bills. I can do some tweets if you want to retweet them for your listeners, Pete, so that folks can pay attention to that effort. And just, as a reminder, about 5 times as many voters want to see food stamps increased as want to see it cut. So don't fall for the BS talking points on the part of this administration.
For sure not. I mean, we're talking on Thursday, and SNAP is actually trending, which is really cool. I see one of your tweets there. Follow her on Twitter at Rebecca Vallas. I know your most recent episode of the podcast, Off Kilter, came out before this was announced, so I'm guessing you're going to be addressing it on your next episode. And folks listening to this podcast should head on over and subscribe to Off Kilter. Will you be discussing that next podcast?
We absolutely will. There's so much more to say. So I really appreciate you putting in a plug where we're going to have a lot more to talk about in terms of how this rule is going to work, who's going to be affected, and what folks can do to fight to expand the program instead.
Awesome podcast, awesome expert working every day to help solve the poverty problems in the United States of America. Rebecca Vallas, as always, appreciate you joining me today.
Thanks, Pete. Always fun.
All right, we go from Rebecca Vallas, who I absolutely love, to Emily Atkin, who I also love and respect. These are very, very smart human beings that work really hard for all of us. Very moral, very thoughtful, very hardworking. Did I mention hardworking? And super smart. From anti-poverty and food insecurity to the climate crisis and Heated with the great Emily Atkin. That's now. Well, last week, the European Parliament declared a climate emergency by approving a resolution declaring a climate and environmental emergency in Europe and globally. And today, the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP25, is kicked off in Madrid, Spain. Does anybody care? I hope we all care. Today through the 13th of December. And in the most recent UN report, we learned that greenhouse gas emissions have risen steadily for the past decade, and the future looks, well, hot. And to talk about it all and much, much more right now with me is journalist and creator of the Heated newsletter, my favorite daily newsletter, Monday through Thursday. You can get it delivered to your email box. Just go to Heated.world and subscribe now. Heated, a newsletter for people who are pissed about the climate crisis. Joining me, Emily Atkin, who writes it every day. Emily, I have a sound effect for you. It's burning. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that.
If we're gonna do
with like evil laughing behind it. That's
maybe
good.
this one's better. How about this one?
Okay. Yeah, that one sounds like bubble wrap.
Fair enough. All right, we've got it. Heated. It's got sound effects because it's my way to try to get Emily to join me as often as possible to talk about her newsletter and everything that she publishes. Emily Atkin, welcome back to the Stand Up with Pete Dominant podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I love coming on, especially when you start your show by being like, the world is burning. You do it in your radio voice and it actually sounds really happy, but it's like terrifying what you're saying.
Well, I purposely read it over happy music. That was the conceit.
Yeah.
That was the only thing I would. If I put the scary music on, then all of those news effects. Those are, kind of the world news stuff that is happening, the headlines that I've seen. But you cover not only those headlines, but so much more. And Emily Atkin apparently was on the phone with the former Secretary of State and Senator from Massachusetts and former candidate for president. You talked to John Kerry the other night. That's what we learned in your Monday newsletter, Heated newsletter, right?
Yeah, I talked to him on Sunday night. I was actually surprised that he was able to make himself available on a Sunday night, but that was, I guess, his media day. He had woken up early that morning to meet the press with Chuck Todd to talk about his new climate change initiative, and I was lucky enough to be able to grab him in the evening.
That means a pretty big deal. It means Heated is doing well. If you're not subscribed, you have to subscribe to this daily newsletter. It's free as of now. And you had a conversation with John Kerry, and that's what you
said that he reads the newsletter.
Right. He said he reads Heated. That must have been pretty cool.
I was like, okay, let me just explain to you what the newsletter is because I'm sure you don't know about it. And he's like, oh, I read it. I get it all the time. It's very good. And I was like, okay.
Oh my gosh. Man, I mean, all these big names, hopefully that matter, are reading it because it's such an important newsletter to get. Maybe Leonardo DiCaprio's reading it. He's in the news.
God, I hope so.
Because the president of Brazil blamed him for the Amazon rainforest. He literally blamed Leonardo DiCaprio or something like that.
I mean, it probably is his fault.
Or Quentin Tarantino. I don't know. Okay, so your conversation with John Kerry was about his new climate initiative, World War Zero. You interviewed him. What is this initiative? Tell me a little bit about it.
So Kerry says that World War Zero is basically an initiative to get people to prioritize climate change, whereas a lot of groups are focused on pushing a specific policy agenda, like the Green New Deal, or perhaps the carbon tax, or maybe nuclear energy, or carbon capture, or something along those lines, strong carbon regulations. The only purpose of World War Zero is to get people to prioritize this, make it their number one issue, get people who don't care about it right now to care about it. And to do that, they're using people, star-studded big names alongside the grassroots community. So what John Kerry told me is combining the grassroots and the top roots. So the climate justice activists on the ground, the youth movement, but then also bringing in big name people, the Leonardo DiCaprios, the Ashton Kutchers, the Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Al Sharpton. There's Jaden Smith is part of it. Big celebrity names, and then also admirals, generals, people in the military community that will be more apt to go into perhaps red or purple states and have those conversations with a more skeptical audience. And they'll all basically be promoting different policy prescriptions for this, which I know has a lot of environmental activists nervous. But the main point is just, before we start talking about a lot about policy, let's just talk about, we have to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the absolute latest. And that has to be a priority now.
Well, John Kerry has always been a pretty staunch environmentalist, and I'm not sure exactly what his Senate voting record was when he was senator of Massachusetts, but certainly as Secretary of State, he worked really, really hard to get the United States into the Paris climate treaties, along with, leaders from all over the rest of the world. But you have to wonder if an initiative led by him and having all these celebrities will make a difference. I hope it does. But one of the questions, because you're such a great journalist, we talked about that on the first appearance of yours here on the podcast, but you reached out to actual climate activists, grassroots types of climate activists, before you talked to John Kerry. What did they want you to ask him or ask about with this new initiative?
Yeah, and honestly, that's something that I would encourage other journalists to do, especially because climate change is getting so hot. Not to make a pun, but I guess I can't help it. A lot of people are jumping into this beat without having a lot of experience. And so a great way to prepare for interviews is just go ask people who are involved about what they want to hear and then make your decision. So I reached out to climate justice activists, people who are working on behalf of frontline communities, that is rural, Black, brown, low-income communities, the ones who are hit first and worst by climate impacts. And I was like, what do you want to know about John Kerry's World War Zero? And the thing I heard most frequently was, where are the Black people? Because the first story that came out about it was in the New York Times. And the Times said, I actually have the paragraph in front of me. It says, former presidents Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter are part of the effort. Moderate Republican lawmakers like Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, and John Kasich, the former governor of Ohio, are on the list. Stars like Leonardo DiCaprio, Sting, and Ashton Kutcher round out the roster of more than 60 founding members. And all those people are white dudes. I mean, I guess Arnold Schwarzenegger is like not maybe like a white-ish dude, but like for the purposes of white dudes, these are all white dudes, right?
Yeah.
And so justice activists, I mean, there's we won't get into it now, but like a long storied history in the environmental movement of being a white-led movement that fails to adequately work on behalf of the communities most affected by environmental issues, which has always been Black and brown people. And so there's a lot of justice activists looking at this and going like, how is this going to be any different? Like, how am I supposed to know that I'm not going to be just sidelined from this, even though I'm the most affected? And so I asked John Kerry about that. And, you know, he answered fine. He answered in a way that his spokesperson provided me a statement afterwards to clarify. So. Oh,
wow. Well, according to your newsletter, Heated, you mentioned that he said, well, you know, we've got Al Sharpton in. And did he mention Stacey Abrams involved as well? It's a weird thing when your first Black person to go to on anything is Al Sharpton, but whatever.
It was actually, I didn't laugh because it's just such I think that's what a lot of older white politicians think as the baseline of like, of course I'm engaging with the Black community. I have Al Sharpton.
Yeah, it's weak.
Which is that's a very 20 to 30 years ago way to think about it. But so, you know, I said, how is this effort going to be any different than the ones that historically left frontline communities behind? He goes, well, we also have Al Sharpton. And then he said, we've got a lot of people of color, you know, and then he said, we also have people who happen to be white. And I'm not going to apologize for the fact that they're there. We have people of color. We have women. We're going to grow it. There's going to be more women. There's going to be more people of color. We're deeply focused on climate justice. And I sort of pressed him on it. And I was like, you know, I'm not trying to make you apologize for having white people in the group. That's not what I mean. You know, what I mean is how can frontline communities be assured they're not going to be left behind? And he just says, then that's when he mentioned Stacey Abrams, said like, you know, he basically said like he didn't write that paragraph in the New York Times, which is, I think, a good point. You know, there are people of color in that group of 60 founding members. It's just that the Times article highlighted all the white people.
Right.
So that sort of created, I think, an illusion of it being more or being less justice centered than it perhaps is going to be.
So you also talked with former Secretary of State for the Monday email of Heated. You asked him about, you know, in terms of the budget and to help us understand, Emily, the funding here and why this is, you know, necessarily different than other efforts, including ones being made by people like Mike Bloomberg, who you mentioned.
Right. So another thing that struck me when I was reading this Times article was that it comes up and it says, and the group has a starting budget of $500,000. Now, $500,000 to me personally is quite a bit of money. I would love $500,000. Somebody please give me $500,000. But, you know, like in the scope of like a group, the budget for a group, that's that's pennies. Comparatively, Mike Bloomberg just launched this initiative called Beyond Carbon that starts out with a $500 million investment and aims to have a $1 billion investment. So that's quite a bit. 500 million is quite a bit more than 500,000. Perhaps 100 times more. So,
but John Kerry says he's gonna. I mean, his answer to you was what? That's just.
He's like, oh, that's just for the first week, which was. I'm so glad I asked it because again, this, not trying to criticize the Times reporting. It's very important. I rely on it all the time. And, it's one reason why I wrote this article, but it doesn't make clear that that's just for the first week. So if you read it, and I actually saw that figure being used by Steve Malloy, who's this really evilly tobacco lobbyist who now works on behalf of the coal industry and Trump administration and all that stuff.
He
was just saying $500,000, that's all you can get. They're losing. And it was just no, it's for the first week. And he's got, and Kerry said to me that they have, several $1 million raised. That night he was going to talk to a bunch of rich people in LA to get more money. And then he's doing a lot of grassroots funding as well. So it's not $500,000. It's going to be a multi-million dollar effort. And obviously it will be bolstered by the attention and the effectiveness that it gets. As any movement is.
Is it too early to ask what readers of Heated, how they reacted to this initiative? And I think you asked the question in the Monday email, whether or not people are going to be signing up for World War Zero. Should we be signing up? Do they need just actual normal people's support for this initiative, John Kerry, or is it just rich celebrities?
It definitely needs normal people in order for it to work, because it is the combination, as Kerry said, of the top roots and the grassroots. It's trying to, Kerry is very much a person who, his messaging that he's putting forward is we're bringing people together. We need to have the broadest coalition possible to fight this. We can't be in factions. We have to all be together, not just grassroots, not fighting on their own, not just celebrities fighting on their own, not just moderate Republicans fighting on their own, not just leftists fighting on their own, but everyone in one place. And the one thing we can agree on is climate change needs to be the priority. So let's start there. So it has to be everybody. I can certainly tell you what some readers are saying, because my readers love to participate.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, I've got a lot of emails that I have to be going through, because I told everyone that I'd put some in tomorrow's newsletter, which might literally just be reactions. I haven't decided yet.
Can you quantify the general tone of the reactions to John Kerry's efforts that you covered in Heated?
Honestly, I would say it's about half and half. There are some people who are like, I totally get, I might not agree with John Kasich, who allegedly cares about climate change, but never wants to stop fracking ever. But I know that we need to start on this baseline, and I intend to sign up. I'm trying to pull up, actually, now that you've asked me, because I remember there was one good one. Well, I can tell you, here's just a sampling of one. It says, John Kerry is right. No nation is taking the appropriate action to combat climate change. America has a president that mocks climate change and science. Our emissions are increasing. The administration is pushing forward with more fracking, more exports of liquefied natural gas, attacks on public lands, dismantling environmental regulations. This is a national and worldwide emergency. Anything that John Kerry can do to get people across the nation to demand immediate and major action on climate change would be a step in the right direction. I'm going to support World War Zero. I already support several organizations working to fight climate change.
Awesome.
So that's one person.
I agree with that reader. I mean, I'm not sure, I understand why anybody would be bitter or jaded or cynical about, wealthy, influential white folks like John Kerry doing this, much less Al Gore or Leonardo DiCaprio. But everybody, it's an all hands on deck situation. So you got to start at the top and the bottom. But let me ask you, Emily, about what is happening right now also in Spain. The UN Climate Change Conference has kicked off there. And my understanding, what I read, is that it's really just ramping up for the bigger conference, which would be next year. And I wonder how much that has to do with the American presidential elections, because if Donald Trump is still president, if he wins re-election again, I mean, we don't even need to begin to talk about what that means for the planet in terms of his initiatives and policies. But are they really not trying to accomplish anything? Because as long as the United States of America is not in within the terms of this conference, much less understanding and agreeing with the situation, then they don't feel like they can get. Are they in a holding pattern? What's the rest of the world?
So for the first thing I would recommend your readers to do actually is there's an article in the Huffington Post by Alex Kaufman. I don't know if you've ever had him on your show, but he's really great. And he did what I think is the best article so far about what COP25, what the meetings in Spain right now, what they mean.
Got it. Looking it up now.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the headline so that you can point your readers to it. But
Spain really might be the world's most important climate test. Oh, interesting. Alexander Kaufman at Huffington Post. I wasn't familiar with him, but he covers climate for Huffington Post. Huh.
Yes. Alex is a phenomenal reporter, and you should definitely follow his work.
Cool.
But so definitely read that. I would say that, what you're saying about is it just they're trying to hold over? It's not even that they're trying to hold over. It's that nobody knows what to do without the United States. Honestly, it's at this point, up until the Trump administration came along, the U.S. really was the leader in these negotiations, and we set the tone. And the Paris Climate Agreement happened in large part because of very aggressive diplomacy negotiating efforts by U.S. officials, by people like Al Gore, by people like John Kerry, and by a lot of different activists. And now when the U.S. goes to these talks, it's just like this radical sea change, right? It's just like all of a sudden we're not there, except we hold these weird sideshow events that are like, Koala's cool, isn't it? Which is not even a joke. We actually do those things. And so we've sent.
I thought you said cola. I'm like, what is soda? Oh, coal. Yeah, it's so cool. It's really actually very hot.
It's just a sideshow. So instead of going and actually leading these negotiations and putting other countries on track and trying to set the stage, we're doing these weird sideshows. And so in a way, these negotiations are sort of a holdover until next year or until the next negotiations, when we might be able to retake the lead and reset the direction again, or a new leader is going to emerge at these talks. Right now, the biggest leader in these talks is China. And so perhaps who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what's going to happen here? But it perhaps could be that a new leader emerges, and by the time we have a new president, we're struggling to take the lead back. But I think that we do have a responsibility. It's not even I think, we do have a responsibility to be the leader, because America has historically contributed the most to climate change. We've emitted far more than any other country, and we've benefited the most from our emissions. That's why we're the richest country in the world. It's because of our emissions. So, we have to be the ones who lead and say, all right, we set an example on how to cause this problem, and we're going to set an example on how to fix it.
You had an email, an issue. I keep not knowing what to call Heated. Anyway, there was one Heated newsletter a couple weeks ago where you addressed the fact that that Trump's EPA is in denial about the effects of pollution on humanity. That basically, you write, in other words, air pollution denial is becoming U.S. policy for the first time. You also include the facts. According to the World Health Organization, at least 7 million people die prematurely every year from exposure to indoor and outdoor pollution. So, Emily, I mean, it's one thing to talk about climate and the effects of climate change, but it's another thing to talk about pollution and how it affects people right now all over the world. How is the Trump administration in denial about the science regarding pollution?
Oh, this has been this thing that's been happening ever since Trump was elected. I started noticing that he was bringing in these advisors who were not only climate change deniers. I mean, that was the baseline. We all know about climate change deniers, but who were saying they wanted to change science policy at the EPA to make sure that the EPA can't use any studies that have confidential human health data. So what does that mean? That's kind of confusing. They're these transparency in science crusaders, right? That's how they talk about themselves. They say, oh, there are these studies that the EPA uses in their hoax studies because you can't see any of the data behind them. They're all human. It's all human health data, and so you can't check up on it. And that's basically every air pollution study ever done. Now, their claims about this being a transparency issue are complete bogus. The reason that science has a rigorous peer review process, and so if there are many different studies published in many different journals saying the same thing, and they have confidential human health data behind them, it's not just like the authors of the study just claimed it and nobody reviewed it. Critical experts from all over the field reviewed that data and put it out there, and that's how it led to publication. And it's confidential because it's human health data. We have privacy laws about. So if you're analyzing me and everything about me for an air pollution study, I don't want my entire body's data out there, right? That's basic thing. So what the EPA has done is it has moved forward with having these policies that prohibit the EPA from using studies, basically all of the air pollution literature that says that air pollution can not only contribute to death or cause asthma, but that it can cause brain damage in children, that it impacts pregnant women, that it, that it causes heart problems or cardiovascular problems, or basically any effective air pollution. And so we can't create regulations based on that science anymore if that policy goes through. It's almost completely finalized right now. So, and that's a huge priority of the Trump administration. It's sort of like a quiet priority. It's not a priority that is talked about quite as much because, as you can see from my long ass explanation, it's super complicated. But one thing that is really interesting about it is that it's the same exact strategy that the tobacco industry used to try and exclude the science of cigarettes from being used by regulators. They tried to say, like, we want transparency in science, so you can't use any of these studies that shows that smoking kills people because it's based on confidential health data. Same stuff.
Yeah, you've covered that well. That is in, by the way, the November 12th issue of Heated. And let's go from the Trump administration to the Democratic race. You have, of course, an issue out about the last debate where I think you have, it's 2 hours, one climate question, a brief climate recap of the fifth Democratic presidential debate. That's the last one. How are we doing? How are the candidates doing? And how is the media doing in terms of asking these questions at the debates?
I mean, it was fun. I mean, I honestly thought that debate, and I think I say that in the newsletter, as a full debate, because I used to be a general political reporter too. I think as a debate, it was actually pretty good. I think the moderators were clear. They kept the candidates under control. They allowed the actual debate between the candidates to happen, but it didn't go overboard. They asked a lot about reproductive rights and women's health and paid family leave, which has not been asked before. But there was only one climate question, and the basic gist of the question was like, how are you going to make climate policy bipartisan, which is a hilarious question because it's like asking like, well, how are you going to prevent the collapse of human civilization, like where everyone's not mad about it?
Right.
And you're like, that's funny. And only 3 or 4 candidates were allowed to answer. And it's sort of like, we're still just getting second tier status on this top tier issue. And that's kind of the gist that we're seeing throughout this debate process. I don't have high hopes that it will change dramatically. However, it is always important to note, I think, that last year we didn't have any climate questions, or last election cycle, like zero.
Right.
So.
All right. Well, let's get to some of just the activists. Before I let you go, I want to ask you about this major protest at the Harvard-Yale football game. 42 climate justice protesters were arrested, including, as you write in Heated, 79-year-old Law and Order Grace and Frankie star Sam Waterston. Hell yeah, Sam, you wrote.
Yes, Sam. Hell yes, Sam.
Talk to me a little bit about the divestment movement and what this protest was at the Harvard-Yale football game, what it meant.
Yeah, Harvard has this, $40 billion endowment, right? And it's still heavily invested in fossil fuels. So Harvard has this slightly growing, endowment. It's growing about, I think, $8 million a day or something. And it's not all invested in fossil fuels. It's invested in a lot of different things. But, the alumni, the student body, their education is funded in part by fossil fuels. And there's a lot of, I think, alumni and current students who are rightfully concerned and saying, hey, I don't want that. And especially at this point where it's pretty much impossible to take action on the federal government level on climate change, people see divestment, getting institutions to pull their investments in fossil fuels as a way to disincentivize fossil fuel production and support, right? And so these movements have worked in many different cases, like the entire UC system, which is an $80 billion endowment, recently completely divested of fossil fuels.
Yeah, that was huge. University of California, yeah.
And there are other financial institutions that have done that too. Insurance companies have done that, and not just because of a moral thing, but because they actually see fossil fuels as a bad investment.
Yeah.
Actually, if you look at the S&P 500 and you zero in on the fossil fuel companies, you'll see that they are actually stagnating the S&P and actually bringing it down in certain ways. It's just not. It's not a great investment to be invested in fossil fuel companies right now. So there's those two main arguments. One, it's like morally reprehensible to be invested in the future of a fossil fuel economy when we're in the middle of a climate crisis. And number two, this is my money, this is my education. Can you please make a better investment choice? And they decided to protest a football game because, as you know, that gets the most attention because, like, you can't interrupt football. It's football, so.
Yeah. We got a lot of attention. The candidates paid attention. The sports networks paid attention. The divestment movement is a really effective movement. And I was really psyched to see that. All right, before we let you go, one more question on one more issue of Heated, which is about Forbes. Why are you being so mean to Forbes? Let's talk about other media. I should not be
so mean to Forbes, shouldn't I?
You're very critical of Forbes. How dare you?
I'm so mean. I just get, whenever people are like, you're being mean, I'm like, the planet is dying. Like, why are you concerned with me being mean?
No, you're being a journalist, really, is what you're being, because you're covering. But I mean, this last question is about journalists, covering other journalists, media criticism, and what did Forbes publish?
Forbes just published some bullshit.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. Yeah.
I just published some fucking bullshit. Am I allowed to say fucking bullshit?
Yeah, of course. It's a podcast.
I published some fucking bullshit.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got so.
Do you swear in Heated ever?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah, I think you do. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I do. And then I get emails from people that are like, "Excuse me, young lady," and I'm like, fuck off.
It's one thing to hear it on the radio. Now I've got to read these words. You know what that does to me?
They're like, be more inclusive. I'm like, find another newsletter.
Anyway, we're fucking with Forbes.
Forbes did this really viral article and it's from one of their paid opinion contributors, their contributor network, being like, koalas are functionally extinct because of bushfires. And koalas are not functionally extinct. They're super in danger because of bushfires and other human caused activities, but they're not functionally extinct. They just pulled this one quote from one person who described them that way and put it in the headline. And then the article went super viral. It got like 3 million views. Now everyone thinks koalas are extinct, which is really harmful because it makes people give up on the fight to save koalas there. So there are all these articles that are debunking that article out there. Now, the second article that Forbes ran by another contributor opinion piece was basically like, because this koala article was wrong, it's a reason to distrust everything that climate activists have ever said. And the article that was called was everything climate activists tell you is wrong. And you're just like, no.
Forbes.
And I went on Twitter and I was just like, if you're getting your climate news from Forbes, perhaps reconsider.
Yeah. Wow.
There are other places that don't incentivize their writers based on clicks. And that's what Forbes paid contributors policy does, is that they pay absolute pennies for contributors to publish, and they'll only pay you more if you get more attention. And so they incentivize bullshit.
Yes, that's partially true. We could talk about this forever of a lot of different media, but really important to know that when it's happening in any outlet, no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Forbes is a major example of that, just because their pay scale and their incentive structure is just like so bad. And also Forbes does not have a great history of caring about climate change very seriously.
Right.
And so they're just more apt to publish, more likely to publish these fucking idiots. Sorry.
No, that's exactly what you should call them. Okay, Emily, let me just play the heated sound effect that I think we're going with here at the end. Everybody, Heated.world. Is this it?
I think that's it. I think that's the bubble wrap one.
Oh, yeah, maybe it's this one.
The other one. Yeah, that one's good.
You like that?
Yeah.
All right, we'll use that one then. There's also this one where it's like just sizzling. I found this one.
Mm-hmm.
No good, right?
That sounds like Raindrop.
Yes. Okay, we got it then. It's this one. It's Heated.world, everybody. Heated.world. Go subscribe right now for one of the best journalists in the country. Independent journalism at its best. She's working her ass off for it every day, too. Monday through Thursday gets delivered right into your email box. Emily Atkin on Twitter at Emorwee. Emorwee, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Emily, thank you as always for talking to me. People love you here on the podcast. And of course, we love reading Heated. Thank you very much for joining me again. I love it.
Thanks, Pete. You were very kind. I really appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk soon. All right. That is all we've got for you today. Rebecca Vallas, Emily Atkin, at Rebecca Vallas, at Emery. Follow them. Tell them you heard them on the podcast. That way they know lots of folks are listening. And they'll come on again. So if you're on Twitter, please tweet them. Don't forget to subscribe to us. Give us a 5-star rating. Consider a paid subscription on Patreon. patreon.com/Pete Dominic. If you're listening on Friday, have a great weekend. Otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in. We will be here 3 days a week until we ramp up to something bigger and better, which we're quickly working on trying to do. And thank you. Thank you very much. Be the change you want to see. Death to single-use plastic, everybody.